The plane hummed with the soft murmur of passengers settling into their seats, the gentle chime of announcements, and the distant rumble of luggage being stowed in the overhead compartments. Excitement and exhaustion mingled in the air, some travelers eager for new adventures, others simply hoping for a smooth flight. Among them was James, a well-dressed man in his mid-30s, carrying nothing but a sleek laptop bag and a calm demeanor. He had flown more times than he could count, and today was just another journey, or so he thought. James found his seat by the window, nodded politely to the elderly woman beside him, and tucked his bag under the seat in front of him. He exhaled, gazing out at the endless stretch of tarmac beyond the small oval window, unaware that within minutes, this flight would turn into an experience he would never forget. As the last few passengers boarded, a flight attendant strutted down the aisle, her uniform crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read Jessica, and she carried herself with an air of authority, perhaps a little too much. She stopped beside James Rowe and frowned slightly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned him from head to toe. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice laced with something almost condescending. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" James looked up, a little confused. "Yes, 14A. That's what my ticket says." Jessica pursed her lips and glanced toward the front of the plane, as if looking for someone to back her up. "Can I see your ticket?" James sighed but remained polite. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and handed it to her. She examined it for an unusually long time, her brow furrowing deeper. "This doesn't seem right," she murmured, loud enough for the people around to hear. "Are you sure you're supposed to be in business class?" A few passengers turned their heads. The elderly woman beside James shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. James, still composed, forced a small smile. "I fly often. I know where I'm sitting." Jessica let out a small, breathy chuckle, shaking her head as if amused. "Right. Well, let me just verify this." She walked away, leaving James holding his ticket, his jaw tightening. He could feel the weight of eyes on him. Some were curious, others judgmental. He had seen this before, the hesitation, the doubt, the silent question lingering in the air. Asterisk, does he really belong here? Asterisk. Minutes passed. The plane was nearly ready for takeoff, yet Jessica hadn't returned. James tried to ignore the stares, focusing on the in-flight magazine he hadn't intended to read. But before he could turn a page, she was back, this time with another attendant in tow. "Sir," she started, her voice firm, "there seems to be an issue with your seat. We may need to move you." James blinked, his patience thinning. "What kind of issue?" "Well," she hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a secret. "Typically, this section is reserved for premium customers." Silence. A heavy, deafening silence pressed against James' chest. He understood exactly what she meant, even though she hadn't said the words outright. The elderly woman beside him stiffened. A few passengers exchanged awkward glances. Someone in the row behind muttered, "What's the problem? If he has a ticket, let him sit." Jessica ignored the comment. "I'll need you to step to the front so we can sort this out," she said. James stared at her, the weight of past experiences, unspoken assumptions, and deep-seated bias hanging between them. He could fight back, raise his voice, demand respect, but he knew how that would be perceived. Instead, he exhaled sharply, unclipped his seatbelt, and stood. Passengers watched as he walked toward the front, where Jessica whispered something to another crew member before turning back to him. "I spoke with my supervisor," she said, though James seriously doubted she had. "It looks like there was a mix-up, but unfortunately, the only available seats are in the economy section." James let out a dry laugh. "A mix-up? My name is on that ticket. I paid for this seat." Jessica didn't waver. "I understand, sir. But if you'd like to remain on this flight, we'll need you to relocate." At that moment, something shifted in the air. A deep, disgruntled voice cut through the tension. No, he won't. James turned. A man in a navy blue suit stood up from a few rows back. His salt and pepper hair and sharp gaze exuded quiet authority. He took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "This man is sitting exactly where he's supposed to be," he said. "And you, young lady, are about to make the biggest mistake of your career." Jessica blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does," the man interrupted, pulling out his phone. "Because I just recorded this entire conversation. And let's just say, it won't look great when your airline's PR department gets a hold of it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Jessica's face paled, her posture stiffening. James watched as her confidence wavered, her authority shrinking. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff." Jessica hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with obvious reluctance, she stepped aside. "Fine," she muttered. "Enjoy your flight." James met her gaze, holding it just long enough to let her know. He saw her, truly saw her, for what she was. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his seat. The elderly woman beside him gave him a small nod of quiet support. As the plane ascended, James stared out the window, his mind still processing what had just happened. But what neither he nor Jessica knew was that karma had only just begun its work. Because by the time they landed, she would learn that humiliating the wrong person in front of the right audience had consequences, far beyond what she ever imagined. Here's the next part of your story. James kept his eyes on the window, watching as the city below shrank into the distance. The engines roared softly, and the seatbelt sign remained lit, yet his mind was nowhere near the altitude they were reaching. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest as he replayed the encounter in his head. He had dealt with moments like this before, subtle jabs, unspoken doubts, the way some people made him feel like he had to justify his presence in places he rightfully belonged. But this time, it wasn't just a passing moment. This time, people had seen it happen. Jessica, the flight attendant, had humiliated him in front of an entire cabin of passengers. She had questioned his right to be there, not because there was an actual issue, but because she had assumed there had to be one. And if it weren't for the man in the navy blue suit stepping in at the right moment, she would have gotten away with it. James had learned to pick his battles, but there was something about this situation that didn't sit right. The elderly woman beside him gave him a reassuring pat on the hand. "Some people think they can get away with anything," she murmured, "but the world is changing." James turned to her, surprised by the quiet strength in her voice. She offered him a small smile, her wrinkled hands folding neatly in her lap. "My husband was in the military," she continued, keeping her voice low. "He always said the real measure of a person isn't how they act when they're in power, but how they act when they think no one is watching." James nodded, appreciating her words, though his thoughts remained tangled. He wanted to let it go. He wanted to just sit back, enjoy the flight, and move on. But something told him that this wasn't over yet. Across the aisle, Jessica moved stiffly, her perfect posture now slightly strained. She had retreated to the front of the cabin after her failed attempt to relocate him, and though she still maintained her professional smile, there was a tension in her movements. Every so often, she cast wary glances toward James' seat, as if expecting him to make a scene. Instead, James stayed quiet. He could feel the stares of other passengers lingering on him for a while before they slowly returned to their own business. But he also noticed something else: whispers. A man a few rows ahead subtly glanced at his phone, scrolling through something with furrowed brows. Another woman beside him muttered something to her seatmate, shaking her head. It didn't take long for James to realize what was happening. The man in the navy blue suit had recorded the whole incident, and now it was likely spreading. Jessica must have noticed too. Her gaze darted toward the passengers who had witnessed everything, her lips pressed into a thin line. The tight grip she had on her service tray betrayed the calm expression she was desperately trying to hold onto. James had no idea who the man in the navy suit was, But he had a feeling the stranger wasn't just an ordinary traveler. The way he had spoken, the confidence in his tone, it was as if he had seen this kind of injustice before and knew exactly how to handle it. The flight continued, and soon the crew began the meal service. Jessica was noticeably absent. Another flight attendant took over, moving through the aisles with polite efficiency. James kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. Where had she gone? Had she been confronted about what happened? The answer came sooner than expected. Roughly an hour into the flight, James noticed movement near the front of the cabin. A male crew member stepped forward, leaning close to Jessica as they exchanged hushed words. Her face was pale now, her usual confidence replaced by something else, worry. James wasn't the only one who saw it. The man in the navy suit, who had been casually flipping through a business magazine, set it down and watched with mild amusement. He didn't say anything, but there was a knowing look in his eyes. Jessica turned suddenly and disappeared behind the curtain leading to the staff area. The male crew member followed, leaving a ripple of curiosity among the nearby passengers. The tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it had deepened. James exhaled, rubbing his temples. He hadn't planned for any of this. He hadn't wanted attention. But now, it seemed like the situation had taken on a life of its own. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. The intercom crackled, and a calm voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We hope you're enjoying your flight. We wanted to take a moment to thank you for flying with us today. We'll be making our descent in a few hours, but in the meantime, if there's anything our crew can do to make your journey more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask." James noted how carefully worded the announcement was. It was the kind of message meant to maintain order, to subtly remind everyone to remain civil. But it also made him wonder, had the pilot been informed about what happened? Another glance at the passengers around him confirmed his suspicions. Whatever was happening behind the curtain wasn't staying there. People were talking, watching, waiting. Jessica eventually returned, but something about her had changed. The stiffness in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her uniform, it was clear she was rattled. She avoided James' gaze completely, moving through the cabin like a shadow of the woman she had been earlier. James exchanged a brief look with the man in the navy suit, who simply raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "told you karma was coming, asterisk." But James wasn't convinced this was over yet, not by a long shot. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He didn't know what exactly was happening behind the scenes, but one thing was certain. This flight was far from ordinary. And before they landed, something told him that Jessica would learn a lesson she'd never forget. Here's the next part of your story. Jessica moved through the aisle with forced composure, but the tension in her shoulders was impossible to miss. She kept her eyes down, focusing on small tasks, adjusting trays, straightening headrest covers, avoiding eye contact with passengers who had witnessed everything. It was clear she was rattled, though she was desperately trying to keep up appearances. James watched her out of the corner of his eye, sensing the shift in energy. The flight had taken on a strange atmosphere, quiet, but charged. Passengers exchanged glances, subtle whispers passing between them. The incident wasn't just lingering in the air, it was spreading. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blue suit was calmly sipping his drink, his phone resting face down on the tray table. He hadn't spoken again since his initial intervention, but his presence alone was enough to keep Jessica on edge. James turned his attention back to the window, trying to push away the unease settling in his chest. He had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, but he knew one thing for certain: Jessica's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. Minutes passed. The flight attendants continued their routine, but there was an undeniable shift. A different crew member had taken over most of the business class service, while Jessica remained mostly at the front, out of sight. Then, just as James was beginning to think the worst of it had passed, movement near the galley caught his attention. A man in uniform, another flight attendant, but older, with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression. stepped forward and spoke to Jessica in hushed tones. She nodded stiffly, her face pale. James watched as the older flight attendant turned and made his way down the aisle. He moved with quiet authority, pausing near the man in the navy suit. "Sir," he said, his voice low and measured, "would you mind stepping to the front for a moment?" The man in the suit set his drink down, giving James a brief glance before standing. He adjusted his jacket and followed the crew member toward the galley, disappearing behind the curtain. James felt his pulse quicken. Something was happening. A few passengers noticed as well, their eyes flickering between each other with silent curiosity. But no one spoke. The quiet hum of the engines filled the space, masking the tension that had settled over the cabin like a thick fog. The minutes stretched on. James tried to focus on the in-flight entertainment screen in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the curtain. What were they talking about? Was the airline trying to control the damage? Then, after what felt like forever, the man in the navy blue suit returned. He walked with the same calm confidence as before, but there was something else in his expression now, something unreadable. As he took his seat, James caught the slight smirk on his lips, as if he knew something no one else did. James hesitated before leaning slightly toward him. What happened? The man didn't answer immediately. He picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and then set it back down before finally responding. "They wanted to know if I was planning on sharing that video." James blinked, and the man chuckled under his breath. "I told them I hadn't decided yet." James studied him carefully. There was an ease in the way he spoke, as if he'd been in situations like this before. He wasn't just any passenger. He knew exactly what kind of power he held in this moment. "Who are you?" James asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The man gave a small, knowing smile. "Just someone who doesn't like seeing injustice." He extended a hand. "David." James shook it, still feeling like there was more to him than he was letting on. But before he could press further, a slight commotion near the front of the cabin pulled his attention away. Jessica had returned, but she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant, a younger woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, was whispering urgently to her. Jessica's face remained composed, but her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. James exchanged a glance with David, who raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Asterisk, here we go, asterisk." Then, as if deciding something, Jessica took a deep breath and straightened her uniform. Without another word, she made her way down the aisle, directly toward James. A hush fell over the nearby passengers. Eyes subtly flickered in his direction, waiting. Jessica stopped beside his row, her hands clasped in front of her. The confident, dismissive attitude she'd worn earlier was gone. Now, she looked like someone who had just been forced into a conversation she didn't want to have. James met her gaze, waiting. "Sir," she started, her voice carefully controlled, "I'd like to apologize for earlier. There was a misunderstanding." James let the words hang in the air. The silence between them felt heavier than before. A misunderstanding, that's what they were calling it. David let out a small chuckle from across the aisle, but he said nothing. He simply watched, intrigued. James finally spoke. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line. She clearly didn't want to be here, didn't want to be saying these words, but she had no choice. The airline had likely gotten involved. "Yes," she said, her voice slightly strained. "I didn't intend to make you uncomfortable. It was never my intention to single you out." James kept his expression neutral. He could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, all of them waiting to see what he would say. He had a choice. He could let it go, accept the forced apology and move on. Or he could make it clear that this wasn't just about him, but this was about something bigger. After a beat, he spoke. "Do you even understand what you did?" His voice was calm, but firm. "Or are you apologizing because you have to?" Jessica stiffened slightly. She wasn't expecting him to challenge her. David smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. Jessica hesitated before responding. She faltered, as if struggling to find the right words. I understand that my approach may have been inappropriate. James exhaled slowly. She still wasn't saying it. She still wasn't acknowledging the real reason behind her actions. He held her gaze for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right," he said simply. "I hear you." Jessica seemed unsure whether that meant she was off the hook or not. She gave a tight nod and quickly turned on her heel, disappearing back toward the front. David let out a low whistle. That was interesting. James shook his head, exhaling. She still doesn't get it. David leaned back, looking thoughtful. Maybe not, but the world does. And something tells me this isn't the last we'll hear of this. James wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but as the plane continued its journey, he had a feeling that by the time they landed, the real consequences were only just beginning. Here's the next part of your story. The quiet murmur of conversation filled the cabin, but the tension hadn't faded. If anything, it had thickened, settling like an unspoken weight over everyone who had witnessed the earlier exchange. Jessica had retreated, her forced apology still lingering in the air, but it was clear the situation wasn't over. James sat still, his fingers lightly tapping against his knee. He wasn't one for unnecessary confrontation, but something about this entire flight felt different. Like something was shifting, something was building toward an inevitable breaking point. David, the man in the navy suit, remained relaxed, sipping his drink with an amused expression. "You handled that well," he said, watching James carefully. James exhaled. "I don't think it really changed anything." David shrugged. "Maybe not for her, but for everyone else." He gestured subtly to the cabin around them. "People are paying attention now." James glanced around. Passengers were still stealing glances, whispering to one another. A few had their phones out, some scrolling, some typing. Whatever had happened wasn't just going to stay on this flight, it was spreading. A chime rang through the cabin, followed by a soft voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain in your seats as we prepare for landing." James let out a slow breath. Soon, they'd be on the ground. Soon, this flight would be over. But something told him the consequences of today's events were just beginning. Then, movement at the front of the cabin caught his eye. Jessica had reappeared, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. She was speaking in hushed tones with another flight attendant, a younger man with a concerned look on his face. Something was wrong. David noticed too. He set his drink down and leaned slightly toward James. "Looks like we're about to hit the final act." James tensed as the younger flight attendant nodded and disappeared behind the curtain leading to the cockpit. Jessica remained standing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Moments later, the curtain parted again. This time, the head flight attendant emerged, the older man who had spoken to David earlier. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unmistakable in his eyes. Determination. Jessica seemed to realize what was about to happen before anyone else did. Her face drained of color, her breath catching slightly. The head flight attendant took a slow, deliberate step forward. The cabin fell into silence as he spoke. "Miss Langley," he said, addressing Jessica by name, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to step to the back of the aircraft with me." A ripple of shock passed through the nearby passengers. People turned in their seats, eyes widening. Jessica's lips parted, but no words came out. The older man didn't waver. "Now, please." For the first time, Jessica looked truly shaken. Her eyes darted around the cabin, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The airline had made its decision. Passengers watched in silence as she slowly nodded and turned, walking stiffly toward the back of the plane. The moment she disappeared behind the curtain, whispers broke out. James let out a slow breath, barely realizing he had been holding it. David chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I didn't see that coming." James gave him a look. "Didn't you?" David smirked. "All right, maybe I did, but still, That was quicker than I expected. The intercom crackled to life again. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now making our final approach. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. James turned to the window, watching as the ground came closer. The city lights stretched out in the distance, a reminder that soon they would all be stepping off his plane and back into the real world. But even as they neared the end of their journey, James knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because something told him that when they landed, the real storm was waiting. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, the wheels rolling against the tarmac as the engines rolled softly in deceleration. A collective breath filled the cabin, relief, anticipation, curiosity. James sat still, gripping the armrest as he processed everything that had happened in the last few hours. But something inside him told him this wasn't over. The flight attendants went through the usual post-landing announcements, their voices steady, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Across the aisle, David stretched slightly, casting a knowing glance toward James. "You feel that?" he murmured, barely above a whisper. James nodded. "Something's coming." Passengers began gathering their belongings, standing to retrieve their bags from the overhead compartments. The usual shuffle of movement filled the space, but there was still an undercurrent of quiet murmuring. Whispers of speculation, of curiosity. Everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Then, just as James unbuckled his seatbelt, a new voice rang through the intercom. But it wasn't a flight attendant this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask that all passengers in business class remain seated for a few moments. Thank you for your cooperation." The tone was polite, professional, but the weight behind it sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. Heads turned. Eyes flickered with concern. James exchanged a glance with David. "That's not normal, is it?" David's smirk had faded. "Nope." One by one, passengers hesitated, unsure whether they should grab their bags or stay put. But before anyone could react further, the curtain at the front of the cabin swept open, and two uniformed airport security officers stepped inside. The tension exploded instantly. Gasps, hushed whispers, even a few startled glances. The officers moved with purpose, scanning the cabin before locking eyes on someone. James followed their gaze, his stomach tightening. Jessica. She was standing near the galley, her body rigid, her expression frozen in shock. The younger flight attendant she had been speaking to earlier stood nearby, shifting uncomfortably as if he already knew what was about to happen. One of the officers, a tall man with a firm but unreadable face, stepped forward. "Miss Langley." Jessica swallowed hard. "Yes." "We need you to come with us." His tone was polite, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Jessica's hands clenched at her sides. "Why?" The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, gave her a long look. "We have received a formal complaint regarding your conduct on this flight. We need to speak with you." Jessica's face turned red. A complaint. Her voice was tight, her composure cracking. Who filed a complaint?" The officers didn't answer immediately. Instead, the male officer gestured toward the aisle. "Please step this way, ma'am." Passengers were glued to the scene, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with open curiosity. Jessica hesitated, her eyes darting around, searching for an ally. But there was none. She turned abruptly, her gaze landing on the head flight attendant. "Are you serious? You reported me." The older man's face remained calm, though there was something firm in his expression. "Jessica, just go with them. The airline will handle the rest." Jessica let out a harsh breath, shaking her head in disbelief. This is ridiculous. But despite her words, she seemed to understand she had no choice. With stiff movements, she grabbed her belongings and followed the officers toward the front of the plane. As she passed James, her gaze flickered to him for just a second. There was no apology in her eyes, only resentment, but James didn't flinch. He simply watched as she disappeared through the curtain, the weight of the moment settling over him. The second officer lingered for a moment longer before glancing around the cabin. Thank you for your patience, everyone. You may now disembark. The tension snapped, replaced by an immediate flurry of motion. Passengers grabbed their belongings, whispering to one another as they filed toward the exit. But James remained seated for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. David let out a low chuckle. Well, that escalated. James exhaled, rubbing his temples. I don't even know what to think anymore. David stood, adjusting his jacket. I'll tell you what to think. That wasn't just about this flight. James frowned. What do you mean? David's smirk returned, but there was something thoughtful beneath it. People like her, they get away with things like that all the time. Until one day, they don't. He grabbed his carry-on. And something tells me this wasn't her first time crossing the line. James considered that, his mind racing. Could it be? Could this have been part of a larger pattern? As he finally stood to grab his bag, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his breath catching slightly when he saw the notifications. Dozens of them. News alerts, social media tags, messages from friends. And at the top of the list, a video. James's stomach tightened as he opened it. It was the incident, the exact moment Jessica had humiliated him, captured from multiple angles. And it was spreading. David glanced at the screen and let out a low whistle. Looks like the world just got a front row seat. James swallowed hard, the realization settling over him. Whatever had just happened on this flight, it wasn't staying here. James stepped off the plane, the weight of the last few hours pressing on him. The terminal was bright, filled with the usual bustle of travelers rushing to their next destination, but something felt different. His phone was still buzzing with notifications, the video spreading faster than he could process. David walked beside him, his usual smirk in place, but his eyes held something sharper, awareness. You seeing this? He asked, tilting his phone toward James. On the screen, multiple news outlets were already picking up the footage. Headlines flashed across the feed. Air hostess caught in shocking act. Passenger stands up to discrimination mid-flight. Airline responds to viral video. James barely had time to process it before a voice called out from ahead. Excuse me, sir. A woman in a sleek airport uniform approached. Her badge indicated she worked in airline management, and behind her, 2 more staff members followed closely. Mr. Carter. James hesitated. Yes. She offered a polite but serious smile. We'd like to have a word with you about what happened on your flight. David let out a low chuckle. Told you this wasn't over. James exhaled and followed the woman to a quiet lounge area away from the main crowd. He could feel eyes on him as he walked, passengers who had been on the flight, travelers who had already seen the video online. Whispers trailed behind him, and the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a movement. Inside the lounge, the woman gestured for him to sit. I want to start by saying how deeply sorry we are for what you experienced today, she said, her voice measured and professional. The airline does not tolerate this kind of behavior, and we are taking the matter very seriously. James nodded, still processing everything. What's going to happen now? She exchanged a glance with her colleague before replying. Jessica Langley has been placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Given the video evidence and multiple passenger testimonies, I can assure you that disciplinary action will be taken. James wasn't sure how to feel. Relief? Closure? It didn't quite settle. And what about the airline itself? This isn't just about one person. It's about how situations like this are handled. The woman straightened slightly, as if she had been expecting the question. You're absolutely right. We're already reviewing our training protocols, and we'd like to invite you to be a part of that conversation. James blinked. Me? She nodded. Your voice matters in this. We want to ensure that passengers are treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are. If you're open to it, we'd like to work with you on how we can improve. James glanced at David, who raised an eyebrow, impressed. After a pause, James exhaled. I'll think about it. The woman smiled. That's all we ask. As James stepped out of the lounge, another wave of messages flooded his phone, but one notification stood out. A direct message. From an anonymous account. Asterisk asterisk, check your email. There's more to this than you think. Asterisk asterisk. His pulse quickened. He opened his email and saw a forwarded thread from an internal airline source. Attached was a document. It wasn't just about Jessica. It was about multiple complaints against her, incidents swept under the rug, passengers ignored, staff warnings dismissed. James felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a single flight gone wrong. This was a pattern. And now the world was watching. James stared at his phone, his heart pounding as he scrolled through the forwarded emails. Each one documented a different complaint against Jessica Langley, some from passengers, some from fellow crew members. It was all there, black and white. Reports of unprofessional behavior, repeated warnings, and yet nothing had been done until now. David leaned over slightly, reading along. He let out a low whistle. Well, looks like someone's been protected for a long time. James exhaled sharply. This isn't just about her. This is about the system that let her get away with it. David nodded. Exactly. And now, the system just got exposed. James' phone buzzed again. Another notification. This time, it was from one of the major news outlets. The story had officially broken beyond social media, and it was everywhere. The airline had already issued a public statement, acknowledging the incident and confirming an internal review. The pressure was on. As they walked through the airport, James felt an odd mix of emotions. He hadn't set out to be the center of anything. He just wanted to get through his flight in peace. But now he was at the heart of something bigger, something that wasn't just about him, but about how people were treated every day. A voice called out from behind them. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter." James turned to see a young woman holding up her phone. She looked hesitant but determined. "I just wanted to say, I saw the video. And thank you for standing up. People don't always do that." James hesitated, caught off guard. "I wasn't trying to." "I know," she interrupted gently. "But you did anyway, and that matters." She smiled, then turned and walked away before he could respond. David clapped him on the shoulder. "See, you're a hero now." James shook his head. "I don't need to be a hero. I just need things to change." David grinned. "Well, sometimes those go hand in hand." They exited the airport, the city buzzing with its usual energy, but something in James had shifted. He wasn't the same person who had boarded that plane. A few days later, the airline reached out again, not just with another apology, but with action. They wanted him to be involved in developing a better approach to handling passenger concerns, ensuring that incidents like this weren't ignored in the future. James thought about it long and hard before agreeing, because this wasn't just about one flight. It was about all the ones that came after. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something better.